the Vedic corpus, where the principles that are similar to what we think of the principles of democracy, which is of election of officials or rulers from the populace, those principles are outlined
In
in
the
something
Rigved.
that is, we know it's a controversial topic on dating it, but it's definitely perhaps even thousands of years before the
Yes.
Greeks.
In the 17th and 18th century, that things which happened in Greece 4 5,000 years ago, if this had not happened, then we would all have been savages and stuff like that was really really common.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the WAC Indian History Podcast. I'm Utkarsh Mohan.
Namaskar, Sumedha Verma Ojha, author, historian, and Utkarsh's partner in this podcast.
Exactly. So, firstly, folks, again, thank you. Thank you for the support so far. Thank you for all the kind words and comments that have reached us after our last episode on Indian marriage. A lot of friends reached out. I appreciate all the support and all the questions. So, just keep it coming. We love the engagement and we are very happy to have you watching everything that we are making.
Don't forget to subscribe. That 88%
Oh,
who is not subscribing.
yes, our subscribers keep growing. Our Instagram followers keep growing, which reminds me, please follow us on Instagram as well. But 88% of you on YouTube are not subscribed. You're just watching us. So please subscribe right now. Okay, so today's topic is going to be something that I am particularly interested in. Not to say that I was not interested in the previous topics, but this one is close to my heart, and I'll tell you why. So, the topic that we're going to get into today is democracy, right? The system of government that we all know today, this modern paragon of perfection, or as good as it gets from a governance standpoint, that has superseded monarchy and everything else that was there in the world before that. Um, this is interesting to me for two or three reasons. Firstly, in common understanding and also in many conversations, this is cited as an example of how Western thought, which produced democracy, is hence superior and hence, everybody is getting modernized by Western thought. It's not an attempt for me to say Western thought or Eastern thought is better. It's just that I want to understand that, firstly, is the notion that democracy came from the West even true? And understand a little bit of the history of it and also the history of what government was like in India and whether there is any similarity to democracy. So, we are really going to deep dive into all of that. The first question that I really have for you is the popular conception of democracy. And actually, what I did before this podcast is I went and looked up something on the internet, and one of the first results that I got was a National Geographic, and this is what it says about democracy. Number one, the ancient Greeks were the first to create a democracy. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, which I'm sure it does. But more importantly, National Geographic says the first known democracy in the world was Athens in the 5th century BCE. So, my first question to you is very pointedly, is it from what knowledge that you have as well, looking at what we know from all of the Indian sources as well, was democracy really invented in ancient Greece? And if yes or if no, where does this idea come from?
This whole this is a great topic, Utkarsh, and governance in ancient India is one of my top areas of research. So I am also very interested in this. So democracy, the word itself obviously comes from Greek antecedents. We use it as though that is the only way to explain a form of government in which people have a voice, in which people have some role to play. So it's used across countries now, even across languages and cultures, as a word which exists to exemplify the people, government of, for, and by the people. And there are very very grandiloquent and magnificent descriptions of how all of this was done in ancient Greece. Not ancient Greece, maybe the city states of ancient Greece, of which Athens
Yes.
was the primary one. Of course there were many others. I'll tell you a few stories and or events, and through that you can try and understand what the answer to this question may be, because it's always not easy when we are going back thousands of years to say yes or no. Sometimes it's a more complicated answer, because for instance, ideas may develop in different places at the same time. And I think that this is what has happened in the case of government for and by and of the people, and I'll tell you why. But first, back to the 7th century before the Common Era. So Solon, who was an Athenian general and an Athenian politician, is credited with having this idea that the people should be the most important in any administration, in any politics. But the person who actually is, or could be called the father of democracy, is the Athenian Pericles. So Pericles was the one who headed the Athenian government at a time that is called the Golden Age of Athens. This is say about, he was born in 495 BCE and he died in 429. So that's the 5th century BCE. This was a time when Athens, these city states kept on fighting with each other. We've all seen, the fight between Sparta and Athens has been immortalized in so many ways.
Yeah.
So, from this funeral oration comes the first understanding or description of democracy in so many words. How do we know this? Because there was a historian called Thucydides. He wrote of Pericles, of the Peloponnesian War in his histories. He was a historian. He was also a... So all this was happening so many thousands of years ago. So why was it important for European nations? How come the idea of democracy has been connected to this? So for this, we'll have to go down a few by-lanes of history. Are you okay with that? A few by-lanes here and there of world history.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So you know that the Greeks were succeeded by the Romans. The Romans were a huge empire who modeled themselves quite a bit on the Greeks. The Romans, as they went on, had a kind of Western empire and an Eastern empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, that is Byzantium, that Eastern Roman Empire collapsed in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. So we have about 2000 years, we've moved in time. But what was significant? A lot of scholars from Byzantium then fled to Western Europe, carrying with them a lot of original Greek works. Because in this whole period of 1500 to 2000 years, whatever ideas the Greeks had or the Romans had been forgotten completely by the Europeans. They were in what they themselves like to call as the Dark Ages. What were these Dark Ages? They were completely controlled by the Catholic Church. And there was no scope of intellectual ferment, of any kind of freedom, of any kind of freedom of expression, no scope for that. And therefore, the flowering of intellect or any kind of development of economy, society, polity was all at a stop. Around this time was also sparked the Renaissance. So during the Renaissance, there was a desire to come out of the clutches, the intellectual clutches, especially intellectual, political, social, cultural clutches of the church, and look back to a time when there had been a very harmonized ideal system of governance, ideal system of society. So around this time when people were looking for something to go back to, the ideal past to go back to, you had a lot of these Greek original pieces of literature coming and scholars coming. So people started reading them in Europe, and then people started translating them. And once they started reading and translating them, they discovered Greek literature and they discovered Greek ideas, and they found them to their liking. It also harked back to this wonderful, magnificent time when military wars were fought and people were noble and ideas were noble and the society was great. So in 1627, Hobbes translated Thucydides' history. And I have already told you that it is in this history of QC diaries that this whole big idea of democracy being for the people and
So
democracy
this
being.
history of universal IDs was it with the folks in Constantinople? It came after the fall, or was
Yes,
the
yes,
Europeans had
yes, yes,
lost
yes,
contact with it
yes,
earlier?
yes, yes. So,
That's interesting. So you're saying Mehmet II is in a way responsible for the Renaissance
yes,
by sacking Constantinople.
yes, yes, the Ottoman Empire, and the fall of
Wow.
Byzantium, and the rise of the Ottoman Empire this side. So what happened at the time, Utkarsh, although again, like I keep saying so many times, we'll do another podcast in this. What happened
Yeah.
with the fall of Constantinople was that there was a certain route through which India and Europe were connected. That route was blocked. However, the links
Yes.
between India and Asia, India and what we now call the Middle East still flourished. From there was a disjunct, and it was the Arabs who took Indian ideas to Europe. So, to a lot of places in Spain, such as Toledo. So, the podcast on mathematics, which we are planning on doing, I will show you
Yeah.
how Indian mathematics actually went via the Arabs to Europe, and which is why, we have things like algebra and algorithms
Arabic
because of,
numerals.
yeah, Arabic numerals, and it was because Al Khwarizmi translated and took certain Sanskrit works to Europe. So it was after his name that algebra was actually named. So this, in a way, changed the dynamics. The free flow from India to Europe stopped. There was a block over in Asia. It remains today. There's a certain thing, since I'm also interested in geopolitics. There's a certain India Middle East economic corridor which was touted. That IMEC is something which is a harking back to the time when ancient Greece and ancient India were directly connected via trade routes. Today, there is a kind of blockage in the Gulf area, and that route is controlled by the Gulf states. That happened after the fall of Constantinople, and therefore, the Arabs became, in a sense, mediators in that period. They became the mediators between ancient Indian ideas and European ideas. Therefore, the Europeans who were trying to rediscover themselves, who were trying to discover new things, they were learning from the Arabs, they were learning from the Greeks. They did not realize that many of these ideas that they were learning from actually came from India. But let's get back to QC
Yeah.
riders,
Yeah.
keeping in mind
Yeah.
what you have just said, which is very important, that the Europeans themselves had lost track of these ideas. They didn't know about them. And there was no democracy in Europe at the time. Think of
Yeah.
1627. Where was their democracy? There wasn't. So, around this time, the 16th, 17th century, in the European imagination, Greece became an ideal past. They want a Renaissance is what? Rebirth. It's not birth, it's rebirth. So, it's a rebirth of those ideas which were there in their pristine and most ideal form amongst the Greek city states, especially Athens. Now, to go on to this Athenian idea of democracy, of by for the people, or whatever you want to call it. So, take a guess, Utkarsh. Do you think that Athenian democracy allowed everyone to vote?
No, it was just certain segment, right?
Yes.
It's just some men. Slaves couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote. My understanding.
Correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct, correct. Both these are, and there was other categories who could not vote also. People who did not own land. If you
Yes,
were
yes, of
landless, you could
course.
not vote.
Only land owning
Yes.
men.
Land owning men. Also, you had to be born in Athens. Suppose you had just been born outside Athens, you couldn't vote. So, this is a very shabby kind of democracy. And in fact, some people who have tried to do some, I would say, a little bizarre angle of approaching it, but still, as to how many people would fit into those assembly rooms in Athens. And they have found that the number of people who would actually fit in is not even 25% of the touted number. So obviously everyone was not participating in that democracy. Even after you leave out women and slaves and landless and those who were born outside, there was X number who should have been there to take decisions, etc. But
Yeah,
according to
yeah.
these calculations, only about 25% of them were there. So there is a kind of idealization of Greek democracy by, putting in things which were not there. I must, of course, say that this universal adult suffrage, we don't expect it in ancient Greece, ancient India, ancient anywhere. Universal adult suffrage is a very modern concept, so we should not also try to project that, it should have been ideally the way we think of democracy now. We'll have to make allowances. I feel
I
that
think
we
that's
have to
a
make
very
allowances.
important distinction that you're making, right? Because when we say democracy, we typically mean universal adult suffrage.
Yes.
In the that I don't think anybody is sitting and making the distinction. I mean, of course, the academics know, but for the average person, vaguely aware of pop culture, vaguely aware of history, universal adult suffrage and democracy is the same. This
But
democracy or
yeah.
universal adult suffrage is what the US wanted to bring to Afghanistan as an example, bad example. But yeah, so it's good that you're making this distinction. These are two different things.
Yeah, these
And
are.
I think that is an important classification to be clear on as we go down this conversation.
So I think what happens, Utkarsh, is today average person thinks democracy, okay, came from Greece. They don't even think Athens, by the way. So they think Greece. So they think today we have universal adult suffrage. So wow, so many thousand years ago Greece had universal adult suffrage. Wow, what a progressive civilization. Wonderful. And who are the inheritors of that civilization? Today's Europeans. So wow, what a wonderful universal line of progress. So these are the kind of jumps in logic which happen because of the popular narrative, and it's so very easy to get carried away by this. So I want to come back to
Such a simple example, right? A movie that I'm very fond of, 300. Right? Or is it that example? Or maybe I mean, any movie on ancient Greece, or if you read anything.
Utkarsh, I have not
They
seen
will
the
talk
film,
about-
so maybe can you tell us a bit about it? I have not seen the film.
Oh, you've not seen 300?
No, maybe
300
I will
is
now.
Where the Spartans held up against the Persians.
Okay. Held up against the Persians and then finally could not.
No, they could not, right? But it's about the last 300. The battle, I'm forgetting the name. Thermopylae, what was the name of the battle?
Okay.
I'll have to look it up. But no, it's not only that. I think there was another famous battle. I remember reading about it. It's always presented as a famous historical what if.
Yeah.
Which is that if European civilization had not succeeded, then today the world would not have this modern age.
Such kind of
Something like that.
grandiloquent and very, very exaggerated ideas are taken as true. And in fact, you're right. These things were stated in so many words in the 17th and 18th century, that things which happened in Greece 4,000-5,000 years ago, if this had not happened, then we would all have been savages and stuff like that, was really, really common. It was absolutely common, and it was more important for them to study those battles and take lessons from those battles rather than coming up with new things. They wanted to hark back to a tradition to show that whatever we are saying, there are very strong roots to that. And in fact, even today, Utkarsh, in the area of international relations, in the area of geopolitics, the kind of terminology we use, so much of that terminology still comes from the Greeks, which is actually, I don't know, it's not okay, because it really limits things in many ways. And if we ever do a podcast on my favorite, geopolitics and international relations, then we'll talk about this in detail. Can I just give you an example? I want to give you an example with my spectacles, because I'm going to read out something. So when Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, very, very important for the academic and intellectual basis of democracy in Greece or Athens. So when Hobbes translated it, there was a certain thing said at the funeral oration, which was translated as, the Greek was translated in English as, we have a form of government which in its administration respects not a few but the multitude, and this is a democracy. A government which in its administration respects not the few but the multitude is a democracy. Okay? Now let's move on. 200 years, 300 years. In those 200-300 years, the ideas that it was a government for, of and by the people became very, very fixed. Like you said, universal adult suffrage, government of, by, and for the people. So when a person called Rex Warner translates the same thing in 1954, how does he translate it? Our constitution is a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority but of the whole people. So you see what has changed. Earlier, what was said, that the government acts for the welfare of the people, the multitude, therefore it is a democracy. Here, power is in the hands of the people, therefore it is a democracy. Do you see the difference?
Yeah,
In
significant
Athens,
difference.
in Athens, power was not in the hands of the people at all. Pericles was more like a monarch than he was like, some kind of elected prime minister of today. He was very much a monarch and a very, very dictatorial person from the records and from what we can see of the kind of directions he gave and the kind of decisions he took. He took a very interesting decision, which is, I think, also a very modern one in a way, that government servants, political people would give their political services for payment. This was a new idea. And this is also a part of the democratic form of government as we see. So we can find out certain things that do have parallels with the democratic form of government that we have today. But Pericles was not a democrat in any sense of the word. He was a monarch. And he just believed that, yes, I will be a benevolent monarch. I will work for the people, not to enrich myself and not to enrich the elite, but the people. So that is also in itself quite a significant idea. It's not insignificant. That the elite will not use power for themselves, but they'll try to use it for the people. And again, we want to hang on to this idea because I'll come back to it. Here the point I was
to be fair, regardless of his actual expression of it, it is true to say that that idea of what he had sparked off what did lead to universal adult suffrage in the West. It did lead to it.
I would not agree with you at all, Utkarsh.
You would agree with that?
No,
okay,
not
tell me
at all.
why.
I would not agree with you because it was just an idea which was expressed by Pericles. He himself tried to do it. He did not succeed because the elite were very powerful.
Okay.
The elite were extremely powerful, and the decisions which were taken by Athens were not taken for the good of its poor people.
No, I'm not saying what he actually did. I'm talking about what they thought he did and how in the post the Renaissance and what it led to. Or would you say that the success of democracy, or rather the emergence of democracy, is not because of the original idea, it's because of other factors?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I feel this is a kind of post facto mapping. This is a post facto mapping. See what happened in England, for example. Look at what kind of monarchy come democracy they had. The whole system was really rotten. They were pocket boroughs where the aristocrats decided who would be the person who would come to the House of Commons from this place. So common people had to kowtow to the aristocracy. Then there was no question of universal adult suffrage. Again, landless people did not get the vote. Extending the vote to every man took time. Extending the vote to every woman took even more time. In my place.
So what were the in I know this, if we go on down this rabbit hole, this can be a whole other topic. But in short, what led to the evolution of democracy, which is you have a bunch of I would really say powerful people, but a bunch of them rather than one person. What led that bunch of people to become every man, and then every woman, and then of course then everybody regardless of race or creed. So what were the forces that led to that happen?
I would think that it came from one in England, for example. It came from abject poverty and complete abject situation in which many people were living. They just could not take it anymore, so they rebelled. We've heard of the way the Corn Laws.
French Revolution.
Kind of the French Revolution, which was of course a horrible bloody thing. But to stop that revolution, then slowly the elite had to inch by inch, give a little, give a little, give a little. I don't think it is a journey of noble ideas. I think it's a journey of power being taken away from the elites, because those who were powerless became completely desperate. They
Yeah.
were, they had nothing to lose.
Hmm.
So the French Revolution is an extreme example, but if you take the UK and you
Yeah.
see, if you take England and you see how things moved, it was because
Hmm.
people started rebelling against this controlling of power, of money, of everything by a handful. And remember, that handful became smaller and smaller and smaller. In the 19th century, it is said that there were about, say, 10,000 people in London who controlled everything in England. This is a rough idea. They were called the upper 10,000
Hmm.
in popular culture.
Oh.
So
Okay.
this kind of thing, was not sustainable because the number of people who had nothing just multiplied a lot. Although it's a very good question, and if academics and theorists could get away from this fixation that Pericles and Solon gave us these ideas, and then Plato and Aristotle, and that is why we have these ideas, we could have some kind of actual real research into this.
Yeah. Very helpful. So what I've taken away from this so far is the difference between democracy and universal adult suffrage, and then the
You mean
notion
Athenian
of
democracy and ancient democracy? Because
ancient
today's
difference
today's
between ancient,
democracy,
yes,
yeah.
correct, difference between ancient democracy and universal adult suffrage. Secondly, the popular notion that ancient democracy equals universal adult suffrage, leading to modern, what we know today as the strength of an idea, due to the strength of the idea, is a romantic, revisionist, post fitting kind of notion.
Yes.
And there are much more other complex forces that led
Yes.
to what we
There
have
was
today.
such a deep-seated yearning for that ideal past, and they located that ideal past in Greece. And then Greece became the mother country. You've got to read. I'm sure, Utkarsh, you have, because you are interested in this area. You must have read of, say, German people or English people or American people writing about Greece. Look at, I
Yes.
have a favorite author called Gerald Durrell. I grew up reading Gerald Durrell. But he has a brother called Lawrence Durrell, very, very serious and highbrow kind of writer, who used to write on ancient Greece. He's dead, of course. You should just read his travelogues when he went to Greece. It's like, oh my God, I have reached heaven. I have reached Valhalla. I have reached the place where everything good about humanity originated. So this is an extremely romantic idea, Utkarsh.
Yeah, I don't think you need to even go back to writers from a different era. I think today in popular culture, if you listen to modern European and American intellectuals, which I do a lot of, right? Because I listen to a lot of podcasts. It's this thing is ingrained.
Yes.
It is literally ingrained. It is ingrained. A lot of things, right? Well, everything, in fact, that we're covering on this podcast series, equality of women, democracy.
Look at the way the story of Helen of Troy has been romanticized. That woman was not in love with her very grumpy and much older than her and horrible kind of husband. She fell in love with someone else and ran away, and they've made it into this kind of thing, the face that launched 1,000 ships and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
But Utkarsh, there's also a very interesting parallel between our Puran, that is the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and the Iliad and the Odyssey, which we must cover one of these days.
Yes. And I think it also comes down to something I think you were telling me earlier, and I forget the book that you asked me to read, which is on my list, which is the mindset of the conqueror versus the conquered, right?
Yes,
Because,
that was Albert
ultimately,
Memmi.
we-
Decolonization and colonization. Albert Memmi.
decolonization. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's ultimately, if you have been colonized and conquered for a long period of time, you have been subtly told again and again, not just subtly, initially very brutally, and now it's more subtle, that what you had was worse, you had a better thing. And ultimately, right now, even though we are free from the clutches of colonization, mentally, there's still a lot of baggage, which I think will take a few generations to iron out.
True. Very true. And
Yeah.
I hope people
Okay, I
like
think we
us
need-
are
yeah, go
going
ahead.
to aid in this, This is exactly what I think one of the purposes of this podcast is, definitely decolonization from my side.
Exactly, absolutely. And it's important. It's very, very important, both in terms of, one is, of course, in terms of people's image of themselves, right? I think ultimately having a more positive self-image of yourself, especially for a large civilization, is good. And secondly, just for there being a more balanced view of the world, in line with what is true, and as much as we can be sure of truth, that's a whole different can of worms. But a more
Yes.
balanced and a more truthful view of the world than what may have happened under a specific agenda.
Yes.
But at this point, I have to force myself, and unfortunately force you as well, to make a hard U-turn, to take a
Come
boat
back.
from ancient Greece and take it over to ancient India,
Yes.
and tell us what's going on over there, right? Going back to my initial question, was there something similar to what the popular conception of democracy is? Was it there in ancient India? And what about the time periods? Because as National Geographic said, 5th century Athens was the first time such ideas emerged. So I would love to hear what you have to say about both of these points.
I think both of us are pretty interested in Greek civilizations. I think we got quite carried away. But to come
Yeah.
back to India, which is our topic for today in comparison with Greece. So in India, in Bharat, as usual, to look for the sources of something, we have to go back to the Vedic corpus. Those are the first expressions of civilizational values. So of course, in the Rig Ved, in the Atharvaved, in the Yajurved, you have mentions of something which I will explain why I do not call democracy, but something which I will call Ganasang. Now this Ganasang is a word, a Sanskrit word, an indigenous word, which is used very specifically again to refer to a system of governance and administration and politics in which people take a part. So like we have been emphasizing, like I said in the beginning, let's not transpose our current values to thousands of years ago. I am thinking of proto-democracy in ancient India as being a system of government in which people play a part, elections play a part, and welfare of people plays a part. So all these things are in a Gansang. The idea of Gansang, the idea of election, etc. is found in the Shruti, which I told you about. Shruti, remember, is the Vedic corpus, that which you hear.
Yeah.
Smriti is that which you remember. Smriti is changeable, it depends upon Desh and Kal. So Smriti in a sense will be different in the 5th century and different today. The sciences, etc. will come under Smriti, which are, as you learn more, things change. Shruti does not change. So in the Vedic corpus in Shruti, you find mentions of elections, you find mentions of kings being elected. I'll go into the actual mechanics of it in some detail later. Then you also find in the Pali canon. So the Pali canon is everything that was written about what Gautam Buddha had to say. So Gautam Buddha...
Just to base us in time, right? So what are the time periods that we're talking about for all of that you're mentioning?
So remember the
Roughly.
Rig Ved and the Vedic corpus, the timeline for that is extremely difficult to actually fix up. We
Yes.
spoke about this in our last podcast when we spoke about the so-called Aryan invasion theory and the way the Rig Ved has been dated to all
Yeah,
kinds of time.
yeah.
So 1500 BCE, which is actually rubbish. That's why I like to just say thousands of years ago for Shruti. Some of the Upanishads, however, may have been written later, say about 1000-2000 years ago. As far as the Smritis are concerned, I would say I'm going to talk a lot about Panini's Ashtadhyay. So that would be about 2300 years ago roughly. And if
So
I
that's
talk
around
about...
the same time as Athens, 5th century BC, or
Yes,
little,
yes.
quickly-
So
quickly.
let me specify something. The Vedic corpus, where I have talked about mentions about kings being elected, etc., are far before the 5th century.
Exactly.
Far.
That's what I was getting at.
Yes. The next thing is that if we go to exact specifics where the Gansang has been defined, the Gansang has been explained, the Gansang has been seen in action. This is called the Mahajanpad period of ancient India. So Mahajanpad means big collection of people. So around say the 8th century BCE, which is again before the Greeks that we were talking about, all of Bharat was divided into 18 Mahajanpads. So city states roughly, just for understanding, it's not as if they are the same.
Yeah.
Just for understanding,
Yeah.
think of them as city states. And of these 18, the important ones were Magad, Vaishali, Kasi, Kosal, etc. Now the
Just before
story...
you get into the details of Mahajansang, so I'm just recounting what you said. the Vedic corpus, where the principles that are similar to what we think of the principles of democracy, which is of election of officials or rulers from the populace, those principles are outlined
In
in
the
something
Rigved.
that is, we know it's a controversial topic on dating it, but it's definitely perhaps even thousands of years before the
Yes.
Greeks.
Yes.
Specific articulations of the system, the Mahajansang, is around 300 years before Athens. Am I getting you correct?
300 years before Athens.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
You're correct.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to put it in.
Yes.
Yeah, we go ahead and explain, please.
These Mahajanpads were of two kinds. One was this.
Mahajanpad, sorry, not Jansang. My apologies.
Yeah,
Janpad.
Mahajanpad. So these Mahajanpads were of two kinds. One were ruled by kings, the classic monarchies. We have no problem understanding that. That's a fairly understandable system. The others were the ones which are a bit of a surprise. These were the Ganasang. And where did we find them? We found them, one important one was north of the Ganga, going up to the Nepal Tarai. These were the Vajjis and the Lichavis. Another very important group of Gansangs or Gansang is are the Sakyas. They are important because Gautam Buddha was a Sakya. He is called Sakya Muni. Then there's another important one, the Mauryas of Pippalvahan. The Mauryas of Pippalvahan, according to one story, not the story, is the one from where Chandragupta Maurya emerged. So we can see that from these Gansangs, some very, very important role models and stars of ancient India have appeared. And many of these are mentioned in the Vedic corpus, in many of the Smritis, in the Purans, and two specific books or compositions which I will mention is the Arthashastra and Panini's Rashtadhyay.
So just a question, because this seems to, and all of this is known for a while, right? This is not new evidence that has emerged in the last 3 years, like say the chariots of Sonali, which is new. This is known. So why has this thing been either not acknowledged or ignored?
Yes, so
has it been explained away?
Yeah, your words are very, very correct. Not acknowledged and ignored. So after 1947, there were some scholars such as Agarwal, Sharma, who have written books. Again, we can reference those books on the democracies of ancient India. But then there were other people who scoffed at them, that you are talking nonsense. So the thing is, Utkarsh, it's very easy to put these under the head of what is called very nationalistic view of history, talking up ancient India, glorifying ancient India based on no evidence. So since the normal thinking, mainstream thinking was that anyway ancient India is a backward regressive cesspool, of course no very inclusive or modern ideas can come out of it. So obviously whatever these people are saying is made up. The people who studied these texts and translated them, they did not concern themselves with the actual meaning. I really like giving this example and I will give it again. I may have given it before for translation. So when they translate something like a brahmachari, who is a student, they will say that a male student is a brahmachari. When they have to translate a brahmacharini, who is a female student, they will translate as a virgin girl. So what is this? This is just prejudice. So if the shlok is saying that when someone marries, you must look for a good brahmachari, which means a good student, a learned person, and a good brahmacharini. From a learned girl, from a well studied girl, it becomes a virgin. You see
how this translation done by an Englishman?
Of course.
Influenced by the church's conceptions?
Of course. Who else? And this is just one example which I like to give because it's a very telling one. There are literally millions of examples like that, millions. And another one which I like to give is from the Vivah Sukta. So in the Vivah Sukta, there are some gifts given with the girl when she is getting married. We've discussed all that in the last podcast. So it is said that when these gifts are given, some cattle is given and there's a certain month in which that cattle must be given over to the side of the var. So in many of our wonderful translators, including I think Wendy Doniger, no, perhaps not Wendy Doniger, it's someone else. They have translated it as these cattle must be eaten. Because what do they want to prove? that it was ancient Indians who ate beef, and the embargo against eating beef, devout Hindus do not eat beef, that is a very later thing, that is Brahmanical. It is not Vedic. So these kind of examples I am just giving you to show you how everything was interpreted according to Eurocentric biases, and the biggest bias was that ideas which we can recognize as inclusive or as positive or as ones which we can use today just did not exist in ancient India. And it was something which had to be forgotten. Our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru said it in so many words that we will not go back to anything which is written in Sanskrit because it's all regressive. So I think it was a mindset, Utkarsh. And this mindset has to change. The ideas of people who are translating have to be, kind of taken into account. Suppose you're reading a translation by Rhys David or by Max Muller, then you have to know that his ideas and biases are there. Also, you have to start translating and reading all these yourself. So this is a very important point that you've raised in the study of ancient India. One, people who do not know the language rely on secondary and tertiary sources for a lot of the ideas that they feel are old ancient Indian ideas, and they also have their own biases which they bring to bear.
I see. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and unfortunately, these things have a very, very tangible outcome in terms of people's conceptions of themselves and their civilization. I was watching this. I really like this TV show. I don't know if you've watched it. It's on Amazon Prime. It's called Made in Heaven.
Yes, I have seen it. I've seen a bit of
wedding
it.
Planners.
Yes.
So one thing that struck me, I think there was an episode about dowry and somebody resisting it, which is great. I am on the same page. But what annoyed me a little bit was the end commentary where it was like overcoming centuries of patriarchy.
Yes.
There is a hidden chauvinistic inside every Indian man.
Yeah.
I was like, seriously?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Why would you have to?
Yeah,
make such a
so sometimes I feel maybe, their heart is in the right place. They want to say things which are, basically good for us. But
the storyline was amazing. I mean, that's exactly, if somebody is asking you for 4 crores dowry to get married, screw them. Get away.
Yeah.
That's perfect. But I think just that commentary is the thing that annoyed me.
And Utkarsh, that brings me to another thing. As an academic, I am always coming in contact with or, coming up hard against a wall, which is that if something bad happens in India, it is because of the culture. If something bad happens in America, it's because a person was bad. If in India something happens, then it's not because that man was bad, it's because the culture is bad. It's because the culture has taught him to be bad. And this is something
I would have to say the tides are changing in the US, not necessarily in a positive way, because I think it's ultimately getting very, very Marxist, where the world is a linear division between the oppressor and the oppressed. Anybody who's not white in the US is an oppressed. Who's not a white man in the US is oppressed. And that has its own logical fallacy. So I think the US, the tide is turning, but not in a way that I think is particularly
not
positive.
in a way that we would like. It's actually becoming worse.
Yeah.
However,
it's becoming worse.
That does not help us. Because even if things become worse in the US, for us it remains the same. That for whatever happens in India, it is Indian culture which is to blame. It is not the person. We've often discussed, Utkarsh, that there are bad actors in any system. What we are trying to discuss is the intent of the system. When we discuss Indian culture, then the intent of the system is supposed to be bad. Bad actors exist everywhere. Bad, by intention systems, do they exist everywhere? Is the Indian system one of them? The answer is in the affirmative if you look at academic works today. I do not agree with that. That the system had an intent of oppression, had an intent of supremacy, etc. And we are going down another rabbit hole.
Yes.
So I will return to the Ashtadhyay and I will return to Panini and I will also return to Arthashastra.
We are not going down a rabbit hole? Okay, good. Either way, anything is fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So, we have these sources from India, I mean Indian sources, and I told you that there were these Mahajanpads. Some of them were Ganasangh, others were monarchies. So there was Ganatantra, which means rule of the people, and there was Rajtantra, which was rule by the king. So it was very obvious that these two clashed, Rajtantra and Ganatantra. These were two separate systems, and these ideas were also different, although we will also see how these ideas in a way integrated themselves later. It was should I tell you? No, I'll tell you that story later. First, let me tell you about the kinds of Ganatantras which were there and how do we know. So we know this because of Panini's Ashtadhyayi. Ashtadhyayi is a book of grammar. So we should not ideally know anything else except grammar from that book, but Panini has given such wonderful, all-embracing examples from all parts of society, culture and polity that you get to know a lot about all these things. So he tells us how these Ganatantras were managed. So there was a Gan, that means the collection of people. This collection of people consisted of everyone. So that whole thing, whenever you study or think of anything Indian, what comes up? Caste. What comes up? Varna and Jati, as we have already discussed. So people from all Varna and Jatis belonged to this Gan. And they could be Brahmins or Kshatriyas or potters or weavers or everything, anything. They all had an equal say. Now,
when
how
you say everyone, does that include women?
Women is a very interesting question, because in the Rig Veda is mentioned the Vidhata. The Vidhata is a collection of people or a place where people from the entire Gan spoke and decided what was to be done in that community, in that clan. And it is very clear, not just from the Rig Veda but from the other Vedic, other mentions in the Vedic corpus, that women were welcome in the Vidhata and they used to speak their mind in it. However, in another place, there are actual descriptions of voting. Where there are actual descriptions of voting, over there for me the jury is out. And I think more research is necessary to know whether women voted, that they spoke, that they were there, they had a presence, unequivocally, yes. Did they vote? I am not sure.
Okay, we don't know yet.
We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe, as I said, I mean, people who are not blinkered by many things have to read a lot of these compositions again to arrive at some conclusion. So anyway, to get back to the way in which these Ganas operated. So there were 2-3 ways in which they operated. One was that they all got together and elected a king. They elected a king who they thought would be good for their security, administration, to take care of everything. The king had to be an exceptional person who could not only, he had to be strong, he had to be noble, he had to be, thinking about the welfare of others. Then only would everyone vote for him. A little bit of a digression. If people are interested in watching something about and learning about Indian governance in the past, there is an excellent series on Doordarshan India which is called Surajya. So Surajya. It will take you from governance in the Vedic period to, I think it comes up to the modern period. I have seen just about 5 to 7 episodes, so I do not know up till where it comes. But what I have seen is an excellent exposition, very researched one, of ancient Indian governance. It's been made by Chandraprakash Dwivedi. Anyone who watches Doordarshan will know this name immediately. There was this smashing success of a series called Chanakya many years ago, 20-30 years ago. Now, he is a very intellectual, academic and learned person who makes them not only as a means of entertainment, but in a very researched and educative way. So, I recommend Surajya to people who want to know about this. So, this was, as I said, electing the king was mentioned in the Rig Veda also. So, this is one method. The second method is for everyone to get together and elect a Sabha and a Samiti. Sabha consisted of those people who were aristocrats from big good families and rich people. Samiti was common people. So it's kind of a lower house and upper house, a faint parallel, or indeed not a faint parallel. At the root, the idea is the same. Because today in the Rajya Sabha, we have nominated people, or we have indirect election. And for the Lok Sabha, we have direct election. And in the Rajya Sabha, we have people who have done well in various things. And then they come there directly without election. So Sabha and Samiti used to give direction to the clan. And this Sabha and Samiti were elected. In the third one, there was a kind of oligarchy. Where
in the Sabha and Samiti, so there is no no one leader, no centralized leader?
No.
That's a very interesting system.
Yes, but I will tell you how it worked, how this Sabha and Samiti worked. We'll just talk about it.
Okay.
The next one was the oligarchy, in which there was a group of people. The Vajjis, the Lichavis, their oligarchy is very famous. And it's mentioned in Sanskrit, Hindu sources, and Buddhist sources. So these are very famous people. You can read about them. Their city, Vaishali, their assembly halls, their treasury houses, all these are very, very famous. So these were the oligarchs. Then we have to come to that idea of, okay, how did these people then actually run things? When there's a king, no problem. The king runs things. And remember, if the king is not liked by the people, that king is removed and someone else is elected, according to the Rig Veda. Okay, so this is elected monarchy in a way, which is a very strange concept. We don't understand it now.
This doesn't sound like a king then. This sounds like a whatever, president or a prime minister. We're just using the word king.
Yeah, maybe, Donald Trump.
Maybe.
So, if there was this Sabha and Samiti and there was this Sangh, there was no, hereditary leader or anything, but there was somebody who would be called the Ganpati. Ganpati was normally an elder. Then there was somebody who was called the Sangh Mukhya. These Sangh Mukhyas were elected. Then there was somebody who was called Santhagar. He would take care of the treasury. Then there was somebody who would, take care of the security aspects, or someone like a Senapati. They were advisors on different aspects. And these were elected. How do we know that they are elected? Because Panini, while giving grammatical examples, explains the whole method of election. So they used small wooden chips or wooden pieces, which were called shalakas, for voting. And there was one person who was entrusted with counting them. He was called the Salaka Gahapati. So he was the election commissioner, chief election commissioner of the day. He used to count the votes. There were also, like in any group, there were political parties, because people can never agree. They always have different opinions. And people coalesce around different opinions. So there were also these political parties. And this is how the Ganasangh actually managed its affairs. There is, let me draw a parallel which is wishful thinking maybe, but based on certain evidence. So, the Lichavis, when each of them was elected, they had a very big kind of grand water body, huge one, in which a sacred water body where they had to take a dip, then they would come out and they would be anointed as the elected member for that year. This takes me back to what is very peculiarly called the Great Bath in Mohenjo-daro, because it is a huge water body with many small rooms all around it, and it is called the Great Bath. One wonders why there would be such a great bath when in Mohenjo-daro, in the entire Saraswati Sindhu civilization, baths and bathrooms were found in each individual house. So what was the need for a big bath? Nobody knows, but the person...
I can also, not to distract, but you have many big baths in Japan. You have many onsens. People do your bath. You have every Japanese person has a very nice bathtub in their house. Even in Singapore, thing they will make sure is they have a bathtub.
They have
very essential part of their life. And of course, they love their onsens, which is hot springs. So even though you have that, people go to those communal baths. But not to take away the point, I'm just saying there is another use also. That's just my
Yeah.
exposure coming in a little bit.
Okay. So anyway, calling it a great bath was just well, off the cuff kind of thing for the person who actually first discovered it. It does not seem to be as simple a thing as a great bath. It could,
Okay.
and most
Okay.
probably it had a sacred meaning and a sacred function, because this was even more thousands of years ago than the Mahajanpads.
So to make that water body and the entire structure was not an easy task. Why was it? Why was so much effort, resources, and obviously money put into that?
Yeah.
It would
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
probably have had a sacred function, and somehow this reminds me irresistibly of the Lichavi method of the sacred dip before you come out as part of the governing body for that year. Like I said, this is just some kind of parallel which strikes a historian when you are looking at different periods of ancient India. Certain parallels strike you strongly. So this is one of the parallels which strike me. To get back to the point, so I've been talking about the Lichavis. These were the preeminent power in terms of the Ganatantras. And there was also a confederacy of many of these Ganatantras, which was called the Vajji Confederacy. The Lichavis were the leading confederacy or the leading Gansang in that. They were a very strong power in the Mahajanpad period, around the 8th to the 5th or 8th to the 5th century before the Common Era. So again, remember, we are talking of times before Pericles. We are talking of times even before Solon. People sometimes speak of Solon in the 7th century. Although that's really wishful thinking and that is really talking up Solon. I don't see any evidence of Solon being a democrat. And in fact, Pericles has been condemned by Thucydides for being a dictator, a monarch, a autocrat, and just doing what he wants to. So Pericles himself is a bit dicey, and Solon is more than dicey. But I'm just
Yeah.
putting
I think.
in perspective.
Yeah. I think one has to understand the amount of investment and outright geopolitical assumed superiority in morality has been built up behind this presumption that democracy, the idea, the inclusive of all came from ancient Greece. I mean, you could make an argument for U.S. foreign policy, which ultimately, really being based on that superiority, that this system is better, this system makes a better life for everyone else.
US
Hence, it is. Yeah, so exactly. So hence it is almost, it is kind of justified to make certain interventions if required to spread democracy. I'm oversimplifying, obviously. There are other considerations, but it's true. This is
No, but you're
inherent.
right, Utkarsh. Mostly this is the fig leaf. This is the fig leaf which is used. What was a fig leaf in Iraq? Absolutely.
Yeah,
What was a fig leaf in Vietnam? Exactly
yeah.
this. So yes, this
And
has
if I think about,
differences.
yeah, if I think about, even if I look at, I'm from I'm from India, but I'm also Singaporean. So if I look at the rod that is used to browbeat Singapore, and also to an extent to India, when India has a stable government, it is, you're not democratic enough. Lee
Yeah.
Kuan Yew, you're a very good
Uh,
person, but you're kind of a dictator.
It's for Singapore. It's a very popular thing to say that yes, okay,
Yeah,
you will be very good and you may have a great standard of living and per capita income, but you're not a democracy. Yeah, that's
yeah,
true.
yeah, and and that whole moral superiority comes from this whole lineage running back thousands of years.
And as
Yeah,
we have discussed at the beginning of this podcast, this lineage has been kind of made up.
yeah, yeah,
And this has
exactly.
been constructed. This whole story, this whole narrative has been constructed. Just like the whole narrative about Pythagoras, about Euclid. Did Pythagoras exist? Did Euclid exist? Probably not. But whole stories have been made around them.
Oh, okay. I did not know
Our
that. So
math
maybe
podcast.
that's something else we need to talk about at some point in
Yes.
time.
When we
I
do a
assume they exist.
podcast, then we will get to know. about the
I hope
existence.
Socrates existed. I hope he had his cup of hemlock. No, or is that also?
Socrates,
Anyways, it's different
Socrates, yes, but Euclid
because
and
there is
Pythagoras,
yeah, yeah,
definitely not. And we
yeah,
must do something on ancient Indian math. But to come back to ancient Indian democracy and Gansang, in the
yeah.
past 1,000 years, I would even say in the past 2,000 years, we have not seen in Indian history any very big dynasty which was a democracy. Why is that? You could well ask me that if there were such strong roots, then okay, where are they? What happened after the Lichavis?
Hmm.
So at the same time, during the Mahajanpad period, when the when Vaishali was the capital of the Vajji Confederation, there was this very powerful monarchy called Magad. So there was a king called Bimbisar and his son called Ajatshatru. Vaishali and Magad were always at loggerheads, and it is a fight between Vaishali and Magad, which is the story of which system would win in India. Would it be Ganatantra or Rajtantra? So Magad
Hmm.
won decisively. There is this story of Amrapali, who was a Ganika, the Nagar Vadhu of the city state of Vaishali, who actually fell in love with the king of Magad. Their love story and the fight between Vaishali and Magad are completely intertwined. And when they are completely intertwined, it is said that it was only after Amrapali fell in love with it's sometimes Bimbisar, it's sometimes Ajatshatru, but mostly it's Bimbisar because Ajatshatru is then supposed to be her son who becomes the king after Bimbisar. It is only then that Vaishali was completely defeated. That too defeated in terms of being taken into the Magadhan kingdom, but their name, their prestige, and some parts of their what can I say in Hindi, what we call a Sanskrit Prabhutva. That means their ability to dominate others remained up till the time of Samudragupta, who was a Gupta monarch of the 5th century CE.
Hmm. Hmm.
So he married a Lichavi princess and he, in a sense, took over the chieftainship of the Lichavis and amalgamated it into the Gupta Empire. So even say 1,000 years after they were defeated by Magad, the Lichavis and the Vajjis and that federation retained their prestige. So obviously the values that they held were also held in some kind of importance by the rest of society. So they
Yeah.
maintained.
So put in a way, our assumed principles of democracy were existing side by side with monarchies in India at that particular time period. Say 300, 200 BC to say what time was Gupta Empire? 600 AD,
Gupta
roughly.
Empire was it started in the 4th century, then it went
Okay.
to the 5th.
Okay. So 400 AD then. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it was there. Yeah.
Yes, it was that prestige was still there. And you said a very interesting thing, as in the principles were side by side, the principles of democracy or Ganatantra and Rajtantra. It is my understanding as a historian and as a political scientist of ancient India that the principles of Ganatantra were absorbed into Rajtantra. How is that? It's because the ideas of Ganatantra were what? They were that people should be important in the whole scheme of things. Not only should they be the ones to maybe administer and be the political leaders, but all policies should be made for their welfare. And there should be work with consensus. I've been speaking a lot about Gautam Buddha. So, Gautam Buddha is said to have given a long description of the Vajji Confederacy. Because, Magad was fighting with the Lichavis and Magad wanted some, it was not succeeding. So it wanted some tips. So one of the ministers of Magad had gone to Gautam Buddha to ask okay, what to do. So
Hmm.
Gautam Buddha had given this whole idea of what to do by saying, how will the Vajjis continue to keep their kingdom intact? So he mentioned important things like consensus, setting up of institutions, thinking about the welfare of the people, and following the practices which have been set up by the entire Gansang for the welfare of the entire clan of people. So he said, if they work together, the Vajjis, then they will never be beaten. So what you must do is to sow discord as opposed to consensus, distrust, discord, do not work with each other, do not build institutions. So can you see how this has a modern echo? In our own countries, all of us talk about, strengthening of democracy, strengthening of democratic institutions. So this was in a sense what Gautam Buddha was telling Magad, that if you break all
Hmm.
these things that the Vajji
Hmm. Hmm.
controversy has, this is why it's so powerful. If you break all these things, you will win. And
Hmm.
interestingly enough, in the Arthashastra, which was composed by Kautilya, who was the preceptor of Chandragupta Maurya, there are whole sections on how to break these Gansangs. And most of them deal with how to sow discord between them, make them distrust each other so that they don't work with each other. They reject whatever has come in the past and all the institutions which have been set up. So this
Hmm.
gives us a very good idea of the fight between monarchy and democracy in a way in ancient India.
Hmm.
So how strong
Hmm.
were the ideas of Gansang and democracy that monarchy in the end had to take over those ideas. It could not just make a monarch the kind of monarch we all think of, the Red Queen
Hmm.
with his head.
Hmm.
Not that kind of monarch. This monarch had to first think about the welfare of the people. So, like I said, it is my opinion that these ideas were taken over by monarchies. So, what happened was that the Sabha and the Samiti, remember them, became the
Yeah.
Parishad. The Parishad which advised the king. This Parishad was made up of ministers. These ministers were mostly selected because of two or three things. One very important thing then was family, which family they came from and how much they were loyal to the king. The second was their own capabilities and their own skills. And of course, Kautilya is an outlier because he says there should also be a kind of test. They should be tested for their knowledge and skills and capability before they are allowed into the Parishad. So it's kind
Hmm.
of like like the Indian Civil Services exam, for example, something like that.
Hmm.
The king was to think again. There is this very significant and seminal shlok in the Arthashastra, book one, which says that in the happiness, in the benefits, in the welfare of the people lies the happiness, welfare, and benefit of the king. The king cannot do anything for himself. He must always do it for the people. This, I think, shlok is important because for me it encapsulates the principles of democracy or Gansang and it
Hmm.
brings them those principles into operation for a monarchy. And the monarch or the Swami had to be a very, very hard-working, perpetually working kind of person. I mean, sleep only 4.5 hours a day and be at work for the rest of the 24 hours. I mean, not 24, 24 minus 4.5. I'm sorry. I don't want to
Yeah.
make it off for 28.5 hours. So he got his time was totally fixed. He had to keep working, could sleep only 4.5 hours and he had to only operate with consensus. He had an inner council which advised him. He had this parishad which advised him. So you see, in spite of Rajtantra, this idea of everything being done for people and the idea that the king is just a kind of, a servant of the people. The king always
Hmm.
called himself, in so many words, the servant of the god. Whichever,
Yeah.
suppose he was a Shaiv or a Vaishnav, so he called himself a servant of that god. He was also, in
Hmm.
fact, a servant of the people. And so I think this is the way in which monarchy and the ideas and principles of democracy got very nicely integrated in India. So, I think, Utkarsh, it's a little unfair for us to think of monarchs as those really, very whimsical, self indulgent, selfish people who
Hmm.
only thought of themselves and of nobody else. and just completely in opposition to the people. Like they would control all the resources, use it for themselves. So we have a very, very bad opinion of monarchs. I don't think that opinion is warranted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one important mental clarification that we should make is, I mean, before this conversation, for me, much like all my peers, you have democracy on one side, which is not really what ancient Athenian democracy, but what we know today, which is universal suffrage. But we equate it to be the same thing. So that's democracy. Then you have monarchy, which is a caricature of a personality-based egocentric exercise for a person, for an individual.
Yeah.
That is our impression of monarchy, and it's pretty obvious when you have this caricature versus this ideal. It's clear which is better, and hence the past which endorsed monarchy, the people of the past must have been pretty stupid, or we've been
Yeah.
progressing, whatever it might
Very
be, right?
stupid.
Which leads to a little bit of modern. I mean, I think there's
Yes.
particularly in this era, I think everybody believes that we are the pinnacle of human civilization, where we are right now. Everything before was stupider, worse. We are getting better and better and better. It's only ways up. You know, history doesn't work like that. I mean, Europe itself has an example, right? Roman Empire, Dark Ages, Renaissance. But the reality is that when you think about what democracy really was in the ancient world, what we think of as democracy, and when you think of what monarchy really was, and which it had to be, because monarchy was a fairly successful system. I would say modern universal suffrage has been at it for maybe 100 years. I mean, 100 years is nothing in the sweep of history, right? Monarchies lasted for thousands of years, so the jury is still out how well this universal suffrage experiment does. But monarchy itself was much more people centric than we think of it as. So I think that mental map that we need to make, that we have, needs to be made a little bit more accurate. Even as we, not just as we think of democracy in ancient India, but as we think about how humans have been and how humans have been living in general over the period of civilization.
And in India, there is always that added little thing that colonization always does. It just makes or tries to paint everything that was yours as really bad.
Mm.
So
Mm.
the Rajas and Maharajas of India have been painted as those people, who would get a diamond-studded carriage for their poodle.
Rolls Royces.
Yeah, Rolls Royces, and really, just spend money like water for their own whims and fancies and not care about their subjects at all. Subjects could be dying in abject poverty. The king will be out in his Rolls Royce wearing his Rolex. But this was not really the truth. If you think of kings such as those of Mysore or of Travancore, they were very, very caring administrations. The welfare of the people was thought of at all times. So, health, education, infrastructure. The kings of Mysore were unmatched in this. You must have heard of Sir M. Vishveshwaraya. He was from there. And Sir M. Vishveshwaraya is one of the modern India, is one of the greatest engineers of modern India. So, to reject Rajas and Maharajas, the way it has been done, and the way it has been painted even for us, that these Rajas and Maharajas were trying to hold on to their own pieces of land, their own kingdoms. They didn't want to at all come into the Union of Bharat, which is also not true. It may have been true of a few cases, but not of everyone. There were 541. So it is only a handful that who had to really be persuaded, whether it was
Mm.
Hyderabad or Kashmir or Junagadh. Few, very few
Mm.
to be persuaded. Rest of the 541, they all integrated into Bharat in a very seamless way. So there are two things at work here, I think, in modern Bharat. One is the way in which these Rajas, Maharajas integrated into Bharat, and well, they are standing for election nowadays, just like anybody else. And they are,
Mm.
I am as much a citizen as the Maharaja of Jaipur, who is, of course, not called the Maharaja of Jaipur now. And the second thing, which is very important, is that the people are also used to having a say in governance. Therefore, when in India, universal adult suffrage was introduced in the constitution, the world did a great belly laugh that this poor country, and you think that this modern progressive democracy is going to work in this country? No way. But what happened? We are one of the most successful examples of a democracy in the world today. Our erstwhile Rajas and Maharajas have also become nation builders. Each citizen has taken to democracy, each citizen has taken to exercising their political will. And they have been doing so consistently for the past 70, 80 years. What explains this?
Yeah, and if you look at uh, other examples, even in the even close by, it's not really been that successful,
Yeah, and but close
right?
by, I really wonder what went wrong, because some of the most powerful intellectuals of ancient India have come from the parts of the subcontinent now known as Pakistan.
Mm,
And
mm.
what has happened over there to change the way in which an entire people think, I don't know. Um,
Yeah, I think that's also a subject for another episode, right? I mean,
hmm.
the diverging paths. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
but you do raise a very important point that given the complexity, given the size, given the sheer destitute state in which India was in 1947, right? And we know what happens when you have countries in that. It takes much less than that for civil wars to break out and for a country to get divided into a bunch of warlords, each of them basically, that is the standard actually when you have a combination of a poor country with a certain system and then the system goes away, what happens, right? Look at what. So yeah, it's actually very remarkable. I've never thought of it like that,
But
but we take it for
that's,
granted. We
yeah,
Yeah.
but it's not something that the world took for granted. You did. And you were born much after 1947, so you took it for granted, but the world did not. They expected India to balkanize within a couple of decades. They expected
Hmm.
all these parts to just fly off and become
Hmm.
parts.
Hmm.
In actual fact, Pakistan and Bangladesh did get divided again, this East
Hmm.
Pakistan and West Pakistan. But Bharat,
Hmm.
but I think not only is the fact that there is a system of thinking about people wherein the ruling classes and the ruled, in effect, did think about each other. The ruling classes thought about the ruled, and the ruled respected the ruling classes. And this is a kind of general statement. In specifics you may find some places where it does not really conform to this principle, but by and large there was an integration, and that integration, I think, is because Ganatantra and Rajtantra have integrated in India many, many, many centuries ago. And then of course there is the glue of civilization. So this is all Bharatiya
Yeah.
civilization. It's that glue is also there.
Yeah, I agree on that. I mean, for me, maybe where I would slightly diverge is one thing that India has in common with other developing countries. Again, I'm just saying perception here, but perception also has plenty of anecdotal examples. Corruption is still there. And maybe I'm a little bit spoiled because, I mean, Singapore, literally zero corruption here. So I think, yes, there is that innate uh, uh, ability for the Indian to accept this system. But I think the concern of the ruling for the ruled, I think, to me seems to be lacking
So
from where I sit.
when you mention corruption, it's very, very significant that corruption has been a problem forever. So, what is one of the basic preoccupations of Kautilya when he writes the Arthashastra? It is corruption. He says that
Okay.
servants and those who are in public life are always corrupt, cannot get away from it.
Hmm.
They are like fish in water. When a fish is in water, how do you know how much water the fish has drunk? So there is a so there is a whole huge system in Kautilyan governance to root out corruption. So there
Hmm.
is audit, there is oversight, there are spies who keep telling everyone who's doing what. So corruption, I think, is a big problem in this part of the world, or maybe actually in many parts of the world. There are many places where there's
Hmm.
corruption, and there is a preoccupation with ways in which to make corruption come down. You see, Utkarsh, corruption was a problem even during the time of Kautilya, as I'm telling you. But Kautilya and Chandragupta Maurya ran one of the most successful economically, socially, and politically kingdoms of that time. And that was the time when 32% of world GDP was contributed by India. So corruption need not be something which is a kind of, end of the game. It has to be managed. It has to be brought down.
Mm.
Corruption is a problem which was exacerbated in the past, I think 100 to 100 centuries, 100 to 100 years, 3 400 years, because of the poverty, the abject poverty that the average citizen was in, and the fact that there was a kind of my bap culture where the people who ruled could literally make or break your life. During the
Mm.
Mughal Muslim period, there was this concept of Nazrana. So you had to give a Nazrana to public officials. During the British period, there was so much that was totally in the control of the rulers. The rule had nothing. So therefore, it was
Mm. Mm.
very obvious that, and the British civil servants, they used to get so much from the people that they ruled. You remember the concept of the Indian Nawab in Britain during the time of the East India Company? Any Englishman who came to India came back very, very, very rich. They were all called Indian Nawabs. Where did they get all that money? And gems and jewelry and money and everything. Where did they get it? Obviously, they got it from the people who they administered. So, corruption is also a result of the brutalizing of
Mm.
the population and of the brutalizing of
Mm.
their psyche and character. And I
Mm.
feel that all this is in need of repair.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, when you have the moment you reduce how the what's the word for it when society is relatively equal. I'm forgetting the word. It's escaping my mind right now.
Egalitarian.
Egalitarian.
Yeah.
Egalitarian, right? When the
Hmm.
society becomes less egalitarian, that's obviously a recipe for more corruption to happen.
And also, when somebody, say, for example, the license Raj that we had in the 60s, just to
Mm.
do
Mm.
any work, to set up an industry, you had to get a license. So then you
Yeah.
to somebody to get a license, and that person would try to, make you fork out as much as he could. So that
Yeah.
was a super recipe for this
Yeah.
control of all resources by the state is a sure recipe for
Yeah.
corruption. It's a little different from whether it is a Ganatantra or a Rajtan, but control by the state of all resources is a problematic issue.
Yeah.
And
Control and allocation. Very
Indian
inefficient.
systems
We know
of
this.
thought about this. In ancient Indian systems of governance, there was some ownership by the state, there was also private ownership, and there was also the state making certain institutions, giving them some things for production, etc., and then buying back the production from them.
Mm. Okay. So this is very interesting. So I think for me, what I've taken away is popular conception is this. Democracy means everybody could vote. This system existed in Athens in the 5th century. This set the template for all the good things that followed in the world that follow us today, the beautiful positive progress that we are making. Other countries, such as India, basically had this personality led monarchic system, which was all about the whims of one person at the expense of everyone else. This is popular conception. Thank God for Western civilization inventing this concept of democracy where everyone is important and bringing and spreading it, helping everybody through colonization. They brought this beautiful idea. Everything became democracy after the colonizers left. This is what we popularly think. Even though we are not colonized anymore, the superiority of this idea, which appears to have a Greek, hence Western origin, is well acknowledged and influences how we think about things. That's the accepted belief. What I'm taking away, based on what we know, based on the evidence, is that what existed in ancient Greece wasn't this beautiful democracy of today where everyone could vote. It was democracy, maybe with a small d perhaps, where it was just a specific group of land owning certain citizens born in Athens who could vote, and that too, not very many of them. What's important, however, is the principle of terms of representation and in terms of considering the needs of the populace. This principle was outlined in the Rig Veda, which, of course, while the actual date is disputed or difficult to discern, was definitely 1,000 years or so whatever the number might be, definitely well before the 5th century BC, well before the times of Athens. Even taking aside the Rig Veda, the specific articulation of what we would recognize as a democratic system was articulated in the 8th century BC in India, with very specific 3 different systems described. Not only that, that system coexisted with monarchy. For a long period of time, it was ultimately historic forces that led to monarchy becoming more dominant. But then when we think of monarchy, it is not a personality-led system, everybody catering to the whims of the ruler. It is much more what we would recognize as a more democratic in principle system, where it's really about the needs of the populace, and the ruler is working with many representatives of the populace to ensure that the best policy is made. And the ruler is really what we would recognize today as an executive or a chief of state or a head of state, not a person sitting in his big fat chair with 20 wives and doing whatever, right? Like the popular, I'm forgetting which British ruler that is.
Henry
So
the
that's
Eighth.
very interesting. Henry VIII, yeah, exactly. So that for me is the quick summary of it. So if you are sitting over here and you have these notions of what democracy is, what monarchy is, what originated where, I think it is well worth examining what these words mean, what existed in reality, and examining some of the principles that underline civilization. And I think which brings me to the third point that you said, that even though monarchy became dominant in India, the so-called democratic principles remained. It remained within the makeup, within the civilizational understanding of the population, which is probably, it's reasonable to say, one of the reasons why when India became a universal suffrage democracy in 1947 to 50, it was able to transition seamlessly to the system and remain successful till today. That's kind of what I took away, which there's so much in there, but also, again, right, for 37 years, I thought of kings as whatever, right, as the king, the high life, right?
You thought of kings like the Red Queen, completely
Like the Red Queen.
and whimsical.
Yes, yeah, it's very interesting. And again, I think it just shows the power of narrative, and also it shows the arrogance of confirmation bias based on what we see in front of us, right? I see a lot of arrogance in terms of feeling that what we know is better and never bothering to look more than 2 steps behind to understand what could be, right?
Yes.
History is not an exercise of,
As
yeah.
you have mentioned so many times, it is not our purpose here to pull down any culture. My purpose
Yes, absolutely not.
is to just highlight that cultures across the world have dealt with situations in ways that have been beneficial to them. They have come up with principles which stand the test of time, and which stand the test of public welfare or universal welfare, to insist that there's only one civilizational value, there's only one civilizational impetus, so to say, which is of any worth in this entire scheme of things. That is wrong. It is Western universalism that I am attacking. It is not precisely Western culture. There are many streams of culture. We don't need to have a monoculture. Maybe like Africa is indeed the dark continent. Has anyone researched African democracy, for example? Look at tribal culture in Africa. Isn't it very egalitarian? Then why can we not say that this kind of egalitarian culture existed in Africa too? Perhaps African values of looking after each other are far better than any democratic Western values that you can think of. So my whole thrust of my arguments is always against Western universalism, that this is it, this is the best, and slowly you will evolve into that. No, there are different trajectories that every civilization follows. And it cannot be said that this is good, best, follow this. That's the point that I try to make every time.
Yeah, absolutely on the same page. And for me, I guess it's just important again, one of the reasons why we do this podcast is just important for you to have the information. So now thanks to somebody else, thank you, who's done the research, not me, obviously. And now and then you can make your own assumptions. You can then interpret what people say, certain positions that countries take with a little bit more information, right? I think, for me, this really drills down to modern Western geopolitics as well. This whole question of democracy. So I think it is important to understand what the basis of that is. And not to say that I'm against it or anything, but now I understand it better. I understand the assumptions that it's based on. I also understand what my position is and what it could be and what I think my country's position should be because I have a slightly deeper
Uh,
understanding. So,
Again, what is important is to push your own narrative according to your own national interest. Western narratives have been pushed according to European national interests for 400 years. We've had enough of them. I think that is why we need to look beyond that narrative and remember all the forgotten ones.
exactly. Wonderful. So this was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it as well. Again, as always, let us know if you have any questions. Keep sending in the comments. Please remember to subscribe, the 88% of you. We know you're there. We are watching you. But no, seriously, thank you again. It's really fun to be doing this, really fun to be hearing from you. And we hope to see you on the next podcast as well.
Thank you. Namaskar. And see you next time.
All right. Namaste.